You are just 3 hours away from round 2 of the leaders' debate. So what's expected to be the hot issue tonight? Will any of the leaders change their strategies for this French language showdown? Joining me now in Toronto is the CBC's news chief correspondent, Peter Mansbridge. And from inside the Government Conference Centre is Radio-Canada's Ottawa bureau chief, Emmanuelle Latraverse. She's on the scene there. And with me in studio, the ever-watchful CBC's own Greg Weston. Well, 24 hours after the English language debate, we head into debate number 2. Peter Mansbridge is with us. Peter, pretty interesting night last night, and I know we watched the analysis and the debate, all of us. What about tonight? Let's keeping in mind what happened last night. What do we expect tonight?
Well, I think you can expect much of the same. The hard part will be for the leaders themselves keep the energy up after last night. It was a pretty good bout. Tonight, you got 3 of the 4 leaders who will be speaking their second language, so that's always a challenge, even though most of them, or all of them, are pretty fluent in French. It's still their second language. About last night, I was very careful last night. I was very proud of myself. Never used the knockout punch phrase once through the whole evening. And I also didn't ask anybody who won, and that comes after years of watching these things where often, we're not right when we make those calls early. It does take a couple of days sometimes to sort out what public opinion is. I can tell you one thing for sure last night. People watched it. I just literally saw the numbers in the last couple of minutes and a breakdown of them. They were close to, on the English language networks last night, there were close to 4 million people watching between CBC, CTV, and Global. Now, that's a pretty good number in terms of the average per minute. Overall, over the 2 hours, you can bet that the number was much higher than that. I'm just guessing here, but probably around, somewhere between 7 and 10 million would have tuned in and out at some point during the 2 hours. The high point seen, and I don't have the data, you may remember, Evan, but the high point was about 10 after 8. That's when the audience peaked. Now, I don't know what the topic was. I hope to have that in the next couple of minutes, but what they were actually speaking about at that moment. But that was when the highest numbers registered, the most interest was being shown. But nevertheless, those are big numbers, shows a significant interest in the election and the debate, and we'll see what that means over the next couple of weeks.
Peter, you're right. These things take a long time to settle in, and you got to read between a whole lot of party spin because the parties rush out and they tell you their leader was victorious and they all claim victory. But you got to filter all the spin through what Canadians are thinking. And last night you pointed out some people call this the midpoint of the campaign, but some call this the very beginning of the campaign, where millions of Canadians decide, you know what, I'm going to check into this campaign. Emmanuelle Latraverse, last night the English language debate obviously has huge engagement, but now we turn into the French language debate. This focus will be more specifically on issues as they relate to Quebec. What do we expect to see tonight after last night's performance?
Well, I think you should expect a debate maybe more centered around values because it's always kind of a central issue of Quebec campaigns. And the dynamics will be very different because, of course, it won't be so narrowed down to the 3 opposition leaders ganging up around Harper because in this case, of course, he's the leader, he's ahead. But the reality is that for the Quebec electorate, they all want to beat Mr. Duceppe. And it's going to be very interesting because I think it's one of the first times in a long, long time that Mr. Duceppe does not arrive at the French debate with the upper hand. He hasn't had the best campaign of all the campaigns he's had. A lot of observers are arguing that he's lacking the issue to mobilize the electorate around him, and that has made some of his support, he's not threatened, but has made some of his support a little bit weaker. And so you can expect the other party leaders to attack him, attack the reason for voting bloc now, trying to capitalize on the voter fatigue around this. And so when you look at it, the dynamics will be very different. I think there'll be a lot more of crossfire in all different directions than we saw last night, maybe.
And, you talk about the bloc, and the Liberals experienced this in the last campaign. The voter turnout for the bloc over the last number of elections continues to go down, and they've got to excite their group, their core group, very badly because it's going down, and there's lots of other things at work. Greg, I mean, last night we're all kind of looking backwards and forward at the same time. Does past performance, is it a predictor of future performance? What do you expect to see in light of what happened last night?
Well, I think last night I sort of had the sense that Stephen Harper came out, dropped the gloves, stuck his chin out, and the rest kind of, for a lot of the debate, went for a wander around the ring. I think tonight is going to be a lot scrappier. Michael Ignatieff has to put on a good show just to hang on to the seats that he has in Quebec. We have this very interesting dynamic where, for the first time, the Bloc is going to be facing off against the NDP. The NDP is threatening those Bloc votes in a lot of ridings. And what the Bloc is particularly concerned about is that if the NDP peel off enough of those soft nationalist votes, it may be the advantage of, it may end up electing some Conservative, even a couple of Liberal seats. So you're going to see, I think, a sparring off between Jack Layton and Gilles Duceppe that we haven't really seen. We saw a bit of it last night. We'll see a lot more of it tonight.
Well, it's interesting. Let me just show you a clip of that. That's interesting because one of the issues that came out, of course, this is the perennial issue, was language rights and, of course, the Bill 101. And this is clearly a moment that Jack Layton was not as prepared for when Gilles Duceppe went after him about Bill 101. Check this exchange out.
A wonderful part of our country where the French language is the language of work, and it's the language of culture.
Not everywhere, you know that.
No, well, and that's why the NDP put forward legislation so that could happen.
So you would agree that Bill 101 applied to all workers in Quebec?
And we have
Bill 101 applied to all workers.
And we have proposed that in the House for all federally regulated.
So Bill 101.
Peter, we watched that. That was one of the many exchanges. That one kind of took Mr. Layton a bit off guard, and he'll be better prepared. I've talked to some NDPers on that. Now, look, the NDP have one seat there, right? Thomas Mulcair. But they clearly, their polls, they seem more confident that they're going to take a bite out of the 47 Bloc seats. How does that dynamic shape out? What are you looking for there? Do I have Peter?
I'm sorry. Yeah, you do. I'm sorry, Evan. You know, one thing I hate when we were doing these things, when I'm the host and I ask a question and the person says, yes, but I just want to tell you something else.
Okay, tell me something. You've got the numbers. I know you've got the numbers. Go ahead.
No.
Tell me about it.
I wanted the breakdown on what was happening at 10 after 8 last night, at least 10 after 8 in central Canada. It was the discussion. This is interesting. It was the day. Remember that? It was a fairly vigorous discussion on immigrants and jobs. And that was the high point. That's when the numbers seemed to peak. Most people were engaged on that issue. It's very interesting.
Well, just to pick up, and that's not an issue that will go away tonight, with reasonable accommodation being a very serious debate in Quebec and one that is a hot button issue. You know, we're talking, and I'll rope you back into my question real quick, and then I'll get Emmanuel and Greg on it. But we will talk about a bit about maybe that will become a hot button issue tonight because it connects certainly in Quebec. But that Jack Layton, Gilles Duceppe, and what are you looking for in terms of that exchange that Greg was just pointing out earlier?
Well, you know, I think there'll be a round 2 on it. I mean, Gilles Duceppe really thought he had something going there, and he pressed it. I've never seen anybody press. It's like watching an interviewer going after his subject matter and continually firing the question, no, but tell me, what do you believe? What do you believe? He kept at it, you know, continuously. So he obviously thinks he's got something he can run with there, and that there's a reason he needs to run with it against Jack Layton. That's interesting, too.
And by the way, at 8:02, it was Jack Layton and Gilles Duceppe at 8:02 when those numbers started to spike. Emmanuel, what do you expect just on the language? And now that Peter's raised it, it's an interesting point, values and immigration. Will that be a hot button tonight?
Well, certainly, but what I wonder is why Duceppe tipped his hand on that Bill 101 thing. Obviously, he destabilized Mr. Layton, and by the time this issue comes back tonight, we can all expect Mr. Layton to have a better answer and be better equipped. And considering the dogfight that they're fighting in certain ridings, it is surprising that Mr. Duceppe didn't wait for tonight to pull that one out of his hat. The big risk, of course, is not that there's huge potential for gains for the NDP in Quebec. There's certainly Gatineau, which is a big race. They need to keep Outremont, and there's a couple of maybe one or two other ridings, but even then it would be a bit far-fetched. But the risk is the risk of dividing the vote. And the issue of values is one that the Bloc will want to raise, but also the Liberal Party, because they think it's the best way to attack Mr. Harper's credibility. And the issue here is to block Mr. Harper in the Quebec City region, try to make him pay for his decision about the sports arena. But also the Bloc has a couple of ridings to protect in Chicoutimi and in other regions. And values is always the catalyst against which the Liberals, the NDP also, but mainly the Bloc wishes to mobilize voters against Mr. Harper. So that's the main reason why it will come back and play maybe a greater role in this French debate than it did last night.
And Greg Weston, last word. The Conservatives have 11 seats in Quebec, but Emmanuel just pointed out some of them are very vulnerable around Quebec City now because of this arena issue. And so Stephen Harper's got a job to talk about that. And one other thing that will come up is the energy issue. Quebec that didn't come up last night, but of course the support now for the Lower Churchill hydro project in Newfoundland and Labrador, that's a hot button issue in Quebec.
Well, sure, but there's also offsetting that. As soon as Mr. Harper gets a question on that, I think he'll be pointing out that there's $2.2 billion coming to Quebec coffers from the HST payout. So that he's hoping that will balance one off against the other. Mr. Harper has some uncomfortable issues, there's no question, to face tonight. And part of course, Jack Layton's popularity in Quebec is a reflection of how Quebecers feel about both of the other Federalist leaders, both Michael Ignatieff and Stephen Harper. They're looking for another alternative. So Stephen Harper's going to be in the hot seat, but speaking of seats, he has to hang on to those 11 seats. That would be a victory for him. They're not expecting to make any big gains in Quebec beyond that.
All right, I got to leave it there. 2 hours, 47 minutes away in our beloved countdown clock. And I think we're just going to dedicate it to Peter. CBC's news chief correspondent, Peter Mansbridge. That was good. Radio-Canada's Ottawa bureau chief, Emmanuel Latraverse. When we're talking about Quebec politics, no one lost in translation, especially not Emmanuel. Good stuff, Emmanuel. We'll be watching tonight, and the CBC's Greg Weston stirring up some trouble as ever. All right, thanks, guys.